In Zoom world, participants in Zoom world, you will have the opportunity to pose questions via the chat. I will moderate and I will try to introduce your questions, but the reality is that I'm probably going to take more questions from the room, but I will do my very best to take questions from the Zoom feed too. With all of that said and done, let me introduce today's speaker, Professor Mark Danner. Mark is the class of 1961 Distinguished Chair in Undergraduate Education at Berkeley. He's also a journalist and writer of sort of enormous accomplishment and reputation. It's a real privilege to be able to welcome Mark, whom I'm also privileged to call a friend, to speak at the Institute today. Mark is a graduate of Harvard College, where he graduated with a degree in philosophy, religion, and English. After graduating from Harvard, he moved pretty quickly into the world of journalism, where he acquired a formidable reputation as a writer and editor. He became a senior editor at Harper's Magazine in 1984. 2 years later, he became an editor at the New York Times Magazine, where he specialized in foreign affairs and politics and wrote pieces about a variety of topics, from the abolition of nuclear weapons to the fall of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti. Mark is today a regular contributor to The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, where he contributes regular sort of long-form articles. International relations and international conflict have been a central theme in Mark's long and distinguished career as a journalist. He has reported live from various situations involving intense interstate and sub-state conflict in Central America, in Haiti, in the Balkans, in Iraq, and more broadly across the Middle East. He has also covered every American presidential election since the highly contested, highly contentious election 2000, down to the most recent, contentious presidential election. Mark, I believe, was actually on the ground when the Capitol was stormed in January 2021. So
literally on the ground
at the Capitol, not part of the insurrection, as you hasten to add, but a reporter reporting on the insurrection. In addition to this immense and distinguished career as a reporter, Mark is also the author of 6 books. His first book, The Massacre at El Mozote, A Parable of the Cold War, was published in 1994. Since then, he has published The Road to Illegitimacy, One Reporter's Travels Through the 2000 Florida Vote Recount, which came out in 2004, Torture and Truth, America, Abu Ghraib, and the War on Terror, which was also published in 2004, The Secret Way to War, The Downing Street Memo and the Iraq War's Buried History, which appeared in 2006, Stripping Bare the Body Politic, which was published in 2009, and most recently Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War, which appeared in 2016. Mark's work has received, many of the highest laurels that the American sort of world of letters has to offer, including an Emmy, a National Magazine Award, 3 Overseas Press Awards, and an Andrew Carnegie Foundation Fellowship. Mark has been with us at Berkeley since 1998, so a decade longer than I've been here, and he teaches at Berkeley in the School of Journalism and in the English department. And just one point about Mark's biography that I do want to mention, because it's especially relevant to the subject of today's discussion. Mark, in 2010-2011, spent a year teaching at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem on the Palestinian side of the 1967 demarcation line. So he really knows this immensely complex and fraught conflict from both sides, from many points of view. Mark, it's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce you to the Institute. So thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Claudia. Goodness, whenever I get an introduction like that, I wish my mother was here. I want her to know I made good. I'm very grateful to the Institute of International Study for inviting me to do this talk. It seems to me there's a lot of anguish around and a lot of suffering because there's a lot of injustice around. And it seems to me that the university should be a place where there's a bit of catharsis when it comes to that injustice, a bit of discussion, a bit of learning, a bit of lessening of the pain. And lately, I think we're in a terrible fix where the university serves really to be the battlefield of opposing points of view without much of a synthesis. I'm going to try to do a little bit of that synthesizing today. So that's the optimistic part of my talk. And, so it's been 6 weeks since the Hamas terror attack on Israel. Israeli warplanes, drones, surface ships are besieging the Gaza Strip. Tens of thousands of troops of the IDF are besieging right now Gaza City. They're outside Al-Shifa Hospital. Gaza City is the most ancient and populous urban center of the Gaza Strip. Hamas's terrorist attack killed, the number now is about 1,200 Israelis, including more than 300 IDF soldiers and women, children, and the elderly. Hamas kidnapped more than 240. Again, these numbers are a little bit squishy. Israel's campaign in Gaza has so far cost more than 11,000 lives. It's impossible to know precisely how many of these are Hamas and how many civilians, but all sides pretty much agree that the overwhelming majority are civilians, and that better than half of those civilians are children. These death tolls are horrendous. These societies are very, very small, and we're talking about 12,000 dead at least overall. A little more than 2 million people live in Gaza. If the US suffered a similar proportion of dead, the death toll in the United States would be 1.5 million. The US has never suffered those kinds of losses in a war, ever. If the US suffered losses proportional to what the Israelis suffered on October 7th, you'd have 42,000 Americans dead, which is to say 14 9/11s. We could go on with these kinds of mathematics, but suffice it to say that these are huge numbers for very small societies. People know people who've died, or people's families have been touched by the death we're talking about. It's 18 years since the Israelis pulled out of Gaza in 2005. They fought 4 wars there since 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021. This is, by the way, showing you some of the damage. The orange is in the first 2 weeks of the invasion. The red is in the 2 weeks since. The blue is where fighting is currently going on. Israeli security professionals refer to these wars as mowing the grass. Hamas, which came to power in an election in 2006, and then won a civil war in which it expelled Fatah from the Strip, which led to the Israeli blockade. Hamas would smuggle in weapons, build infrastructure, stage rocket attacks on southern Israel, and finally, after a certain number of Israelis had been killed and injured, the IDF, the Israeli political leadership, would decide it was time to move in and mow the grass. That is, they go in and they debilitate Hamas by destroying its weapons, killing its leaders, wiping out many of its foot soldiers. They would also kill, as you see, disproportionate number of civilians. Palestinians killed on the left, Israelis killed on the right. This has been a characteristic of the Haganah, actually, Jewish defense forces since before the independence of Israel, that you always have disproportionate deaths to prevent the same attacks from happening again. So you see, that doesn't have the most recent, obviously. Afterward, Hamas, that word is an acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement, would promote new leaders, they'd acquire new weapons, they'd recruit new soldiers, and the entire process would begin again. Thus, the grass starts growing. Eventually, it needs to be mowed one more time. Now, mowing the grass is an important phrase, I want to suggest. It suggests the evolving Israeli attitude to the Palestinian problem, that rather than it being solved by some diplomatic arrangement, like the two-state solution, It simply needs to be managed. And it can be managed with perhaps a few score Israeli deaths, Palestinian deaths in the low thousands, without the Israelis having to give up the land or their power over the land for a Palestinian state. Indeed, during the Trump administration under the aegis of Jared Kushner, the Israelis managed to negotiate peace agreements with the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and the Moroccans. And they were working to conclude, as we all know, a peace agreement with the Saudis, which is the big prize, when the October 7th attack happened. They concluded all of these agreements without significant concessions to the Palestinians. That is, the Palestinians were basically, I mean, it was a few pro forma phrases and so on, but the Palestinians were basically ignored. And the assumption was, we can make peace, we can do all these other things, and the Palestinian problem is under control. This is the very situation that Hamas's bloody attack on October 7th was designed to overturn. As a Hamas leader told the New York Times the other day, the attacks were, I'm quoting, designed to change the entire equation and not just have a clash. We succeeded in putting the Palestinian issue back on the table, and now no one in the region is experiencing calm. Another Hamas spokesman told the Times, I hope the state of war with Israel will become permanent on all the borders and that the Arab world will stand with us. In other words, you want to pull the Arab world from making peace agreements with the Israelis to having them stand with Hamas in armed struggle. So these attacks were designed not only to hurt the Israelis, but to make it impossible for them to ignore the Palestinians. They were also intended to put pressure on the Arab leaders who were negotiating these separate deals. It's very hard if you are even an autocrat in Saudi Arabia to make a deal with the Israelis when the Israelis are killing thousands of Palestinians. I'll speak more about that background in a second, but let me just underline that for all their brutality, and they were extraordinarily brutal and savage, it's misleading simply to consider the attacks on October 7th lone acts of terror. October 7th cannot be understood without acknowledging the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank that began more than 50 years ago in 1967, and the blockade that was imposed on Gaza in 2007 by the Israelis in response to Hamas's victory. It can't be understood without taking into account Prime Minister Netanyahu's longtime policy of supporting Hamas as a counterweight to the PLO and as a guarantee, given Hamas's frank rejection of negotiations, that there would never be a final peace agreement based on the two-state solution. And finally, it cannot be understood without taking into account Israel's current policy of managing the Palestinians, even as it expands settlements on the West Bank, instead of agreeing to give up land in a two-state or other diplomatic solution to the 56-year occupation. So, before dawn on October 7th, 3,000 missiles greeted the Sabbath day. It was also Simchat Torah. And struck Israel. Several thousand Hamas fighters came over the border in pickup trucks, on motorcycles, even in motorized paragliders. They surged across the supposedly impregnable fence and concrete walls and into Israel. The first step was a number of drones took out the Israelis' very vaunted system of observation posts, which had automatic machine guns that fire on any breach in the fence. They used drones to blow those up quite efficiently. The Hamas, I'm calling them fighters, we can call them soldiers, we can call them terrorists, militants. They were all of those things. Hamas separated into small units. They dispersed to attack and overwhelm 6 Israeli military bases. They caught many of the soldiers asleep, still in their beds. They killed them all. They killed about 300, something between 300 and 400 soldiers. Then they spread out to more than 20 towns and settlements and attacked, among other things, a musical rave or trance concert, the tribe of Noba, that had been going on all night. There ensued 4 or 5 hours of carnage as Hamas militants went from house to house murdering civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. They tortured and they raped. We are just finding out today about a lot of the rapes, just a report out of Israel just before I left here, and mutilations. I was going to, by the way, show some footage from these things, but it was all so grim, I decided to show this. We'll see in a second what this is. They killed the most at the Tribe of Nova concert, where perhaps 260 young people died. One survivor who fled returned to the rave and described heaps of bodies, some of them beheaded, and a woman lying naked from the waist down with blood coating her thighs. This was the frank murder and rape and torture of civilians against all laws of war and civilized conduct, and we should not hesitate to condemn it in the strongest possible terms, and I do condemn it. These are, maybe pull out a little bit, Morelia, so we can see the whole. This is where all of the attacks happened. All those red dots represent dead bodies. And if you go, for example, to the music festival, zoom in and touch each one, you find the name, very often the photograph. Kidnapped, age 23, murdered, age 22, murdered, 41. These kids were dancing all night, so this attack happened just as they were continuing to dance and, with the dawn. In fact, many of them thought the original missiles were fireworks that the festival had put on. Let's just do a couple more. David Yair, a lone soldier who was actually at the party. Anyway, this is a fascinating website that I recommend you take a look at. It shows all of the sites, including the kibbutzes. Let's look at that kibbutz Be'eri for 1 second. There's the timeline. Daniel Levy, 34. Daniel was murdered while treating wounded. Mordechai Neve, 76. Okay, killed on duty. He was a sergeant, that's a soldier. As I said, something over 300 soldiers were killed, but overwhelmingly the victims were civilians. Many of them were tortured. A substantial number were beheaded. There are a lot of things up on the web that are very horrible about what went on here. Suffice it to say that it was an orgy of killing that lasted for 5 or 6 hours before the IDF finally, much of it had been restationed up around the West Bank, finally came down and killed the attackers. And about 1,500 Hamas attackers were killed on Israeli soil. So the numbers, I said, remain uncertain. Given the state of many of the bodies, Israeli forensic workers are having trouble identifying the dead and distinguishing Israeli civilians and soldiers from Palestinian militants. As I mentioned, 1,500 of the latter died. Now, this is event, nothing like it has happened in Israeli history, has occasioned what might be called the return of history. The psychological toll, especially, is very great. Modern Israel has its roots, obviously, as a shelter for Jews, protecting them from pogroms, and especially that greatest pogrom of all, the Holocaust, in which at least 6 million died. The pictures, and there were a huge number of pictures. Many of these militants wore GoPro cameras on their helmets. They used cell phones, their own or ones stolen from the Israelis, and they took a huge amount of footage, much of it very shocking footage, and loaded it up online almost immediately. Was it to crush the morale of the Israelis? Was it to show what they had done? In any event, it was everywhere very quickly. Those images ushered back into Israeli psyche the darkest days of their history and the specter of insecurity and death in their own homes. Given Israelis' faith in their army, in the IDF, and their certainty that it would keep them safe, this has been a vast shock. I'd say vaster than the shock Americans suffered on 9/11. Everybody knows somebody was killed. These little stories about how they were killed are everywhere in Israel right now, the small narratives. Palestinians are also suffering a return to history, or rather a highlighting of a history that never left them. Some of the land the Hamas militants seized and drenched with Israeli blood had been Palestinian land, had villages on it that were obliterated. Before the Nakba of 1947-48. Nakba means catastrophe. It's what the Palestinians call the Israeli War of Independence. And during that period, at least 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their land to become refugees on the Gaza Strip, then administered by Egypt, or the West Bank of the Jordan River, then administered by the Hashemite dynasty of Jordan. When Israel bombs their neighborhood and demands they leave their homes in Gaza, which Israel did the first week, telling them to move south, Palestinians quail under the dark shadow of a dark history. When they fill the roads of Gaza, slowly pushing themselves and their meager belongings south toward Egypt, they recall similar images of 1947, 48, and 1967. And they wonder whether they'll be allowed to return to their homes. Israel responded to the October 7th massacre by putting Gaza under siege. They cut off deliveries of food, water, fuel. They cut off the electromagnetic spectrum. So they cut off, in effect, information, and began striking Gaza from the air, from the sea, and from the land. This was no surprise. As I said, this will be the fifth time since they disengaged from Gaza in 2005 that the Israelis have mowed the grass in this way. But this time is different. Prime Minister Netanyahu has pledged to eradicate, that's his word, eradicate Hamas and set up a new government in Gaza. He said the Israelis will provide security there for some time to come. I'll talk about this possible future in a couple of minutes, but let's look a bit at the war itself. The American National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, described on CNN the other day the problem Israel confronts in Gaza. What Israel's facing, this is Sullivan, is a terrorist enemy who hides among civilians, who uses civilians as human shields. And so it has an added burden of trying to prosecute this campaign against that terrorist group while distinguishing between terrorists and innocent civilians. That doesn't lessen its responsibility, says the American, to operate according to the rules of war. And we have continued to make that point both publicly and privately, and will continue to do so as we go forward. We are democracies. And as democracies, we have to be different. We have to abide by the rules of war. We have to do our utmost to protect innocent civilians. And that means being targeted and careful in military operations and to try to reduce and try to avoid any loss of civilian life. Okay, this is kind of standard stuff, right? If you know anything about the law of armed conflict, you could put it more precisely by saying the Israelis have the legal right of self-defense, and they're exercising it now. They were attacked. They're exercising that right by attacking Hamas. They do not have the legal right to kill as many civilians as they want, okay? Now, it's not per se illegal, according to the law of armed conflict, to kill innocent civilians in war. You can kill innocent civilians in war, and you're not doing anything illegal. But these civilian deaths must be in the cause of striking a legitimate military target, and the number killed must be proportional to the importance of the military objective. In the terms of the law of armed conflict, this is the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality. At West Point, they define the latter as follows. The rule of proportionality requires that the anticipated incidental loss of human life and damage to civilian objects should not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage expected from the destruction of a military objective. So our latest figures from the Ministry of Health show that more than 11,000 Palestinians have died in Gaza. My sources tell me that about 3,000 of those are combatants. So say 8,000. Now, all indications, including, by the way, from the US government, suggest that these estimates are very low. About 45% of all residential buildings in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. It's a huge number, which means there are likely many hundreds or thousands of civilians buried beneath the rubble that now covers the Gaza Strip. Now, we're told to think of this as collateral damage. Incidental, I put it in my title for this reason, incidental deaths in the cause of justified killing. And to oppose that to terrorism, where you're going out intentionally to kill civilians. I want to say I agree that these two things are different. Intentionally killing civilians is different than killing them as collateral damage when you're bombing, for example. But it's not that different. It's not that different. They're dead. Thousands of people are dead. In both instances, you're killing a large number of civilians, and you're responsible for that, even if, in the case of the Israelis, it's not your primary intention. More specifically, are the Israelis following the principles of distinction and proportionality? When we see an attack on Jabalia refugee camp, supposedly in the service of killing a Hamas commander hiding beneath the camp, we are talking about hundreds of civilians killed. The initial number was 300. It now is in the 200s in order to kill one Hamas commander. It is hard to see how the Israelis in this attack, and indeed in the entire campaign, are following the principle of proportionality. And indeed, the US National Security Council spokesman actually remarked last week, I'm paraphrasing, that there is scant evidence, that's a quote, scant evidence that they're following the principle of proportionality. It seems possible that the IDF contents itself with determining if it is a legitimate military target, then drops some leaflets urging residents to flee, which they often cannot do. Then they bomb. Hard to be sure they perform the due diligence for proportionality at all. They assure us that they do, but they're not willing to describe exactly how, as numerous pieces have showed, especially the one in the Washington Post. There's some evidence, on the other hand, that this bombing is intended to make Gaza uninhabitable. We've heard from various members of Israel's far-right cabinet that, quote, now is the time to solve the Gaza problem by expelling the population. And indeed, a Ministry of Intelligence document, Israeli document, leaked 2 weeks ago shows at least some parts of the government have put in place real planning to make this, to accomplish this. So do some figures with high government responsibility in Israel want to seize the chance to undertake an expulsion? I think it's fair to say that yes, they do. Prime Minister Netanyahu's refusal to say specifically what the plans are for administration of Gaza after the end of hostilities is quite disquieting in this regard. So are the images of vast movements of refugee Gazans clogging the roads from north to south. Well over half Gaza's population is now displaced. I should say displaced again. Will such an expulsion happen? Probably not. Egypt would not admit the Gazans, first of all, or the people of Gaza, I should say. They're not really Gazans. Second, any move to expel Palestinian civilians would surely ignite the regional war that the Biden administration has sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean to prevent. Right now, Hezbollah's militia in Lebanon has 100,000 artillery tubes. Could you put up H, please? 100,000 artillery tubes and rockets pointed, we're slightly out of phase, okay. Has 100,000 artillery tubes and rockets pointed at Israel, but they've launched only a handful, which has led to the evacuation of many towns in northern Israel. 200,000 Israelis are internally displaced right now from the south and from the north. The Houthi forces in Yemen have also launched rockets at Israel, but these have been minor attacks, gestures only. All these forces arrayed around Israel's borders and Hamas itself are financed, trained, and to varying degrees directed by Iran. Okay. So, oh, I have a laser pointer. How astonishing. Except it doesn't seem to work. There we go. Look, can anybody see that? Technology, the bane of my existence. Anyway, you see Hezbollah is right here, Hamas down here, the Houthis right here, actually over here, Iran right here. Okay. This axis of resistance, supported by the Islamic Republic, is a revolutionary force challenging the status quo, which consists of the Sunni autocracies in the Gulf, here, 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 and here. Led by Saudi Arabia and backed by the United States. In trying to mediate a deal between Israel and the Saudis, the Biden administration was essentially, among other things, trying to solidify the status quo coalition. So we put the Israelis together with these Sunni autocracies, we make them much stronger as a bulwark against Iran. Let's put up the next slide with Iran on it. We have not seen any direct evidence that Iran ordered the October 7th attacks or even knew of them ahead of time. But if it did, it would make strategic sense. As I mentioned earlier, Hamas acted in part to put the Palestinian issue back on the table after all these agreements that had simply ignored it, and to upset those very negotiations with the Saudis. Very difficult for the Saudis to sit down and sign a peace agreement with the Israelis when the latter are killing thousands of Palestinians. Saudi Arabia may be an autocracy, but they have to care what their people think. Watching Israel kill large numbers of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip drives Arabs out into the street, thus putting moral pressure on their leaders, whether they rule an autocracy or not. And that is happening now. You're seeing it all over the region. Anyway, this gives you a rather more lurid picture of the resistance front. You'll see that Iraq is part of it. Our brilliant war rendered that a Shia regime, which is now allied with Iran. And that was a good idea. Okay. It's worth remarking here, I think, that by going into the Gaza Strip and killing so many Palestinians, the Israelis are doing exactly what Hamas wants. Thus, all the provocative video clips of murders and atrocities that Hamas posted were intended not only to demoralize the Israeli public, but to provoke its government into overreaching in its response. This sounds familiar. Similar to 9/11, when Osama bin Laden wanted the United States to go into Afghanistan. We did it one better and went into Iraq, too. We were more than willing. The October 7 attacks were in part intended to provoke the Israelis not only into killing an ungodly number of Palestinians, which they're obediently doing, but into undertaking what will likely be a bloody reoccupation of the Gaza Strip. All of this is likely to be politically catastrophic for the Israelis. Here we come to the matter of the two wars that I mentioned earlier. The first war is the Israeli assault on Gaza, which they undertook in the cause of self-defense after the terrorist attack on October 7th. I have suggested some of the reasons I think parts of this war are probably illegal, according to the law of armed conflict. But I don't doubt that after that attack, the Israelis have the right, under international law and under any moral system you could name, to defend themselves. One of the most basic, if not the most basic, duties of the state is to defend the lives of its citizens. Certainly the Israeli state failed miserably at this on October 7th, when Hamas fighters spent hours and hours and hours attacking and killing Israeli citizens before the IDF finally reached the scene and intervened. It's likely the major reason Israel is responding with such overwhelming force and is killing so many in Gaza is the political one of making up for that failure and restoring, as it were, the power of the IDF's deterrence. Tom Friedman the other day made this assumption clear. Let me quote him. There's a conviction in the Israeli army that it must demonstrate to the entire neighborhood, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the Houthis in Yemen, to the Islamic militants in Iraq, to the Hamas and other fighters in the West Bank, that it will stop at nothing to reestablish the security of the borders. While the army insists that it's hewing to the laws of war, it wants to show that no one can out-crazy Israel to drive its people from this region, even if the Israeli military has to defy the US, and even if it does not have any solid plan for governing Gaza the morning after the war. Tom Friedman. Needless to say, proving that no one can out-crazy Israel is not a justification for ignoring the laws of war and killing a disproportionate number of civilians, which I think it's rather evident that Israel is doing. It is also not an excuse for making strategic mistakes, like reoccupying the Gaza Strip. All of this might be seen in the light of that other quieter war that Israel is fighting, which is the war to absorb and finally annex the West Bank. These are incidents since October 7th on the West Bank, violent incidents, usually involving settlers. It is quieter because Israel is not bombing the West Bank, though by any measure it's a bloody endeavor in which hundreds of Palestinians are dying at the hands of settlers and the Israeli army. It's a war of conquest, fought by displacement of Palestinians from their lands and homes, and sometimes by demolishing those homes. Nearly 10,000 homes were destroyed in 2021, the last year for which figures are available. At least 14,000 instances of other displacements, affecting more than 200,000 people. And we know that this year alone, 227 Palestinians have been killed on the West Bank. The vanguard of these West Bank warriors are the settlers, who come in many different flavors. They're secular Israelis who simply want to take advantage of cheap apartments, subsidized apartments, all the way over to true believers in the project of bringing all of historic Judea and Samaria fully into the Jewish state. Today, more than 700,000 Israelis, 10% of the population of the country, live as settlers on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Thank you. Alongside about 3 million Palestinians. When the first Oslo Agreement, the original two-state solution, was reached, the number of Jewish settlers on what was to be a Palestinian state was 250,000. So since that agreement, it has increased threefold, the number of settlers. Now, I should add quickly that the matter is more complicated than that. It's always more complicated than that when talking about these issues. Everything having to do with the West Bank and the entire Israeli-Palestinian problem is complicated, a veritable tangle of historical and geographical claims that becomes impenetrable the closer you get. I remember the first time I went to Ramallah, I was picked up by this brilliant driver, Arab Israeli from Jerusalem, who spent the entire drive giving me a disquisition on areas A, area B, area C, access roads, bypass roads, green card, blue card, who needs to go through checkpoints, who doesn't need to go through checkpoints, tunnels, newly built tunnels, old tunnels. It was masterful. I still regret that I didn't tape record it. It was masterful. And it was this picture of this insane place. Every time I called him, he would continue my lesson. The complexities never run out. Okay? These are checkpoints. These are closed roads. These are access roads. Some people can use them, some can't. These are half checkpoints, which means sometimes they're open, sometimes they're not. You drive up to them, you don't know whether they're going to be closed or not. It is insane driving around the West Bank. You are constantly stopped, particularly if you're a Palestinian. If you're an Israeli, there are special roads that have been built for you on which Palestinians cannot drive. Anyway, when it comes to the complexity of the space, the ambiguities about who can walk where, who can drive on what road, who must pass through checkpoints, who must not, the West Bank must be the most impenetrable space on Earth. There's a reason many consider this Israeli system of control a variation of apartheid. I have problems with that comparison, but I understand why people use it. The space on the West Bank is certainly the land of Kafka, no question about it. As with Gaza, the critical dates here are the War of Independence, or Nakba, 47-48, and the Six-Day War. The story is very familiar. I'm going to go through a potted, very fast history. In 48, the British, who've been administering Palestine under a UN mandate, withdrew. A committee of the UN presented a plan, and there we have the plan, to divide the land between Arab and Jewish populations. The Jews got slightly more, about 55%. The Jews accepted it. The Arabs did not accept it. In a complicated war that followed, Jewish militia forces seized control of most of the land and expelled much of the Arab population, who fled to the Gaza Strip under the Egyptians and the West Bank under the Jordanians. It's a lot of controversy about who left where, when, and why. It has been the the conviction of the Israelis ever since that most of these people left because they were told to. The new Israeli historians, particularly Betty Morris, are quite convincing on showing that most of these were expulsions. Most of these were expulsions, according to Plan Dalet, Plan D. The Israelis did not allow these 700,000 Palestinians to return to their homes, claiming they fled at the instigation of Arab leaders. When the war came to an end, the new state of Israel was in possession of 78% of mandatory Palestine, and a large percentage of the pre-war Arab population were refugees. In the Six-Day War, 67 Israeli forces conquered the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Israel now governed 100% of mandatory Palestine, including what has become millions of refugees, about 5 million to be precise. That is in Gaza and the West Bank. There are many more millions in other countries. Indeed, if we look today at the land between the river and the sea, that is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, we find that the populations are nearly equal. If you add the population of Gaza to the population of the West Bank to the Arab population of Israel, you get about 7 million. And there are 7 million Jews in the same space. The Arab population is probably slightly higher. While Israelis enjoy the full rights of citizenship in a democratic system, the Arabs do not. Israel Arabs are in many ways second-class citizens in a polity that now declares itself a Jewish state. On the West Bank, as I said, Palestinians live under military rule without political rights. And in Gaza, after Israel's disengagement in 2005, Palestinians live under dictatorial Hamas rule. There's been no election since 2005. And under an Israeli blockade meant to punish Hamas, but that punishes all Palestinians unlucky enough to live there. As the UN general recently put it, with rare poetry, if there's a hell on earth, it is the lives of children in Gaza. So it must be said that for all the fevered talk of Israeli democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel is actually a strange hybrid political beast. Half the population under Israeli control lives in a democracy, the other half does not. Close listeners will have noticed that I have not mentioned again areas A, B, and C, which my driver Samira first explained to me. These are divisions established by the Oslo Accords of the early and mid-90s that gave Palestinians some rights, or anyway the right to live under the security regime of the Palestinian Authority in Area A. let's see, area A, you'll see is the tan section. Area B is the very light tan section. So area A is where the Palestinian Authority supposedly controls everything. Supposedly. I say supposedly because the Israelis at the end of the day control the PA. Now, you might say that it's not the Israelis' fault that the PA, the former PLO, is corrupt, incompetent, and autocratic. That's partly true, but the PA has become merely an extension of the Israeli security architecture in the West Bank, and Palestinians know it, which is why there hasn't been a true election there since 2005. The PA would almost certainly lose, as Hamas, which similarly was elected in 2006, would likely lose an election in Gaza. So Mahmoud Abbas is in, I think, the 13th year of a 4-year term. Okay, I can't do justice to this history here, obviously. If you stroll into the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem, you'll see thousands of books about just this. I haven't read them all. I've read a few. But I want to make some simple points about the peace process. The first is that the two-state solution was hobbled from the start because it proposed to solve a problem that really encompassed most of mandatory Palestine, with a solution involving only 22% of it. That is the West Bank and Gaza. Now, this is a very simple principle, right? But I think it's not considered enough that if your solution is a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, you are not restoring most of the refugees to their land. Again, it's obvious, but it bears repeating, it seems to me. This meant that from the first, the two-state solution couldn't offer justice, only a possible end to outright war. But repeatedly, the chance of even that solution coming to pass has been overturned by extremists on both sides. I have in mind not only Palestinian suicide bombers who attack buses and pizza restaurants, but Israeli terrorists who attack mosques and assassinate prime ministers. Not only Hamas, but Israeli settlers and the right wing in Israel want all the land from the river to the sea. That's what Hamas wants, to establish a theocratic state. That's what the settlers want, most of them. As a consequence, when it comes to the peace process and the two-state solution, violence has repeatedly won. And even as the process has unfolded over many years, the land has never ceased to change under the determined efforts of the settlers, either supported by or at least suffered by successive Israeli governments. This includes labor no less than Likud. So all the time these negotiations have been going on, all the time the high politics go up and down, the settlements continue to be built. The access roads continue to be built. Many of you may have heard President Biden yesterday in Woodside. Anybody hear that press conference? Nobody at all? Telling the world that he's made it clear to Bibi and his war cabinet that the only way out of this is a two-state solution that's real. God bless President Biden. He doesn't give up on this, and I have respect for him. I have no doubt that he sincerely believes this. What I do begin to doubt is whether a two-state solution is any longer physically possible. Even as the physical space of the West Bank has evolved into a series of isolated Palestinian municipalities and villages divided by settlements and bypass roads and tunnels and all the myriad infrastructure of a half-century occupation, the possibility of a mostly contiguous Palestinian state on this land has become ever fainter. East Jerusalem is mostly cut off by settlements in the wall. This is supposed to be the capital of the Palestinian state. So are various other Palestinian population centers, right? You can see some of this. Could you go back to the last slide? Yeah. These are little islands, as you see. All of this was planned. It was well planned, very intelligently planned. It is impressive, this planning. These are facts on the ground and not the frail promises of peace. And meanwhile, the settlements grow and grow, and the settlers become ever bolder in attacking Palestinian inhabitants. The agreement on the two-state solution is sporadic, repeatedly put off track by acts of violence. The growth of the settlements and the division of the West Bank that make a contiguous state impossible is consistent and constant. And finally, the simple fact is that support for a two-state solution has collapsed within Israel itself. In the current Knesset, the Labor Party, these are growth and settlements, 93 to 2023, you'll notice how they are grouped in between these bits of area A to cut them off, okay, minutely. Okay. Finally, in Netanyahu's current far-right cabinet, I was going to say the Labor Party has only 4 seats in the current Knesset. Meretz, another champion of the two-state solution, is out of the Knesset entirely. They don't exist anymore. In Netanyahu's current far-right cabinet, there is much more support for an annexation of the West Bank. I'm talking about explicit support for it. That is these people's position. It should be annexed. And more support for expelling Palestinians from Gaza than there is for a two-state solution. To move, perhaps forcibly, tens of thousands of settlers out of the West Bank and back across the Green Line would take enormous political support. And remember, we're talking about moving only a relative handful of the settlers, because the solution would give Israel this chunk of settlements, but you'd have to move some from here. We can talk about that in the question period if you want. Even if that support existed, moving those settlers could split Israeli society along its very obvious fault lines. I'm talking about splitting the army, splitting its institutions. But there's no sign that such support for a two-state solution exists. And every indication that the October 7th attacks will diminish further what support there is. And so the quiet war on the West Bank goes on. Settler violence becomes more organized. The army mostly supports it. So these are vigilantes who are supported by the army, who are killing Palestinians. The population of settlers steadily mounts, and with it the facts on the ground that make a two-state solution ever less likely. As President Biden stubbornly insists that the two-state solution is the ultimate answer here, the one-state reality becomes ever more undeniable. That one-state reality is that of Greater Israel, a state where half the population, the Arab half, lives either as second-class citizens or under permanent military occupation. As the illusion of the two-state solution melts away, and the October 7th attacks and the Israeli response seem very likely to accelerate that process, the reality behind it will become ever less deniable, that the Israelis as a collective have in effect decided to keep control of 100% of the land, even as they condemn its Arab residents to permanent disenfranchisement. But the Israelis attempt to manage this state of affairs with periodic doses of violence by mowing the grass every few years has failed. In the end, and I say this with great sadness, that is the real meaning of October 7th. If the two-state solution is slipped away and the Palestinians can no longer be managed by mowing the grass, then what kind of future awaits the Israelis and Palestinians? In the near term, many Palestinians in Gaza and many IDF soldiers will die in Netanyahu's cause of eradicating Hamas. I very much doubt Hamas can be eradicated, but they certainly can be removed from power, as, by the way, the Taliban was. If that is, the Israelis are willing to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. President Biden also told us yesterday, I made it clear to the Israelis that it's a big mistake for them to occupy Gaza and to maintain Gaza. I don't think that works. But if that doesn't work, who will replace Hamas? Perhaps indeed the Saudis or the Turks will be willing to come in and run Gaza, but I doubt it. Perhaps Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority will be willing to return, 16 years after Hamas evicted them, but the experience may be a rough one. Hamas may well be forced underground, but it will not be eliminated, any more than the Baathists could be in Iraq. Hamas will have its say, and whether the occupiers are Israelis or Palestinian Authority or Turks and Saudis, that say may well be had with bombs and bullets. What seems clear from the miserable violence of the last 6 weeks is that the Palestinians will not stand for their own permanent disenfranchisement. The one-state solution, for that is what we have today, it is, despite all the negotiations, what we have had for 56 years, cannot work by denying indefinitely civil and human rights to Palestinians. It's been a cliche for many years that if Israel holds on to all the land, it would be forced to decide between being a Jewish state or being a democratic one. That is, the Israelis could either grant citizenship to the Arabs over whom they rule, which would mean Israel was no longer a Jewish state, or they could continue to rule over them and disenfranchise them, in which case Israel is no longer a democracy. As we speak, the Israelis have in effect chosen the second option. With equal numbers of Jews and Arabs now living between the river and the sea, but only one people with full civil and political rights, Israel, as we stand here, is no longer a real democracy. But October 7th and all its horrors suggest that this situation is untenable, or is tenable only if Israel is willing to suffer this kind of violence and give it out in return indefinitely. As the United States learned after 9/11, some political problems you can't kill your way out of, no matter how powerful you are. To such a grim future, there are only two alternatives. Palestinians will either have their own state or they will have their full rights within the one Israelis have built. And if the latter comes to pass, well, in Israel, with its electorate divided equally between Arab and Jew, will be a very different Israel. It could be a multi-sectarian democracy. It could be a federation of some kind. It's impossible to know at this moment. But I fear that Israelis, by making the two-state solution impossible in practical terms, have made the choice to live with the Palestinians in a single state. The question is how long it will take before they recognize the implications of this. How many years will pass before they grant the Palestinians the civil and human and political rights that will make them full members of a multi-ethnic polity? How long will it take before we get there? I fear we will be counting not only in years, but in lives lost. And as yet, we cannot see the end. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark. So let's open the conversation to questions. I have one or two questions already coming in via Zoom. But if anybody in the room wants to respond first, if you like.
Yeah, I wonder what you think of the 2007 and 8 surge in Iraq as a kind of useful heuristic to see a potential different path the Israelis could take that could, through massive counterinsurgency operations and a prolonged occupation of the Gaza Strip, actually reduce violence dramatically and stabilize things in the same way the surge in Iraq did until the misguided attempt to pull troops out prematurely, which resulted in the resurgence of ISIS?
First of all, that's a great question. And the tell was in the last line. You have to keep the troops there. Everybody talks about 2011 being an early pullout, but that, in fact, was what was agreed to with Bush. And the question is, how long would troops have had to stay? People now say, well, they could have left 20,000. It would have been fine. I covered Iraq, and I don't believe that that's true. But to go back to your really interesting question about Gaza, you'd have to go in probably with larger numbers than they are right now. You'd have to set up forward operating bases, small bases on the ground. the Israelis would have to be all in occupying Gaza. Now, there's a problem with that, which is that they need a lot of troops for the West Bank, and that's why there weren't troops there to begin with when the October 7th massacre happened. So I think you'd have an initial problem simply getting the number of troops for that kind of operation. And they would have to be there for a long time. I don't know how long. I mean, I can't see the end of it. I can't see Hamas at a certain point saying, or not Hamas, excuse me, the residents of Gaza saying at a certain point, okay, we're fine. We won't vote for anybody who supports a state for us. We'll just be here. That's kind of what I was trying to argue. I guess, what you say sounds plausible at the outset, but I think it would take a long time. It would take a lot of resources, and it would take a kind of political will in Israel that I don't think exists for the Gaza Strip. They want to be out of the Gaza Strip, right? They don't want to reoccupy it, but they're going to be forced to, I think. Anyway, I wish I could be more encouraging.
Mark, one of the slogans one hears now is critical of Israel is that it's a colonial state, and that the establishment of Israel itself is an expression of European colonialism. You spent a lot of time writing about colonialism and imperialism and the like, and I wonder if you could just talk about that.
I tend to think those words are used in a way that's obscurantist a lot of the time. I think, there is a colonial, Israel's a fantastically complicated and interesting society. They're the Ashkenazi, who were the the Jews who came from Europe, who used to be the elite, and who are that old elite are the ones who backed the two-state solution. Then there are the later arrivals, the Mizrahi, from the various points in the Arab world. And then finally, you have got the Russians, who tend to be very right-wing and came in the 90s. And they have, the Mizrahi and the Russians have tipped over the political system in their favor by sheer numbers. I think the colonial, to get back to what you asked, it is a colonial state. A lot of, the U.S. is a colonial state to begin with. The Israeli state is a colonial state much more recently. I don't think that analysis is very helpful a lot of the time. I think you can read Frantz Fanon, and you can. There's actually a very good piece in the London Review of Books right now by Adam Schatz that uses a lot of Fanon's analysis and talks a lot about Algeria and analyzes this in the frame of colonialism and the Palestinians colonized and fighting a war to free themselves from the colonizer. But I think that parallel breaks down. The Israeli Jewish population is not the French, even though the French were there for 120 years in Algeria. The Israelis don't have anywhere to go back to. They can't float across the Mediterranean and go back to France. There are no pieds noirs. So I think that on the one hand, it's illuminating, but on the other hand, it's somewhat misleading if we think of it in the context of all the battles of decolonization that went on between the Second World War and the end of the 60s, that's shown in Battle of Algiers, for example. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on your, going off of that, your reluctance to refer to it as an apartheid state, and then also separately on the topic of the Mizrahi Jewish, at least shift toward the majority, what the sentiment is like with the conflict now, because I know historically a lot of oppression toward the Mizrahi Jews in Israel has aligned Palestinian and Mizrahi Jewish views.
That's an interesting point. Well, the apartheid question, I just think it's like calling somebody a Nazi. it has to do more with emotion than a bit of analysis. So I don't think it's very useful. People use it as kind of a swear word. I think there's truth to it. I mean, Palestinians are now in kind of Bantustans on the West Bank. It's not completely ridiculous comparison. There's some truth to it, but I don't think it's useful because it offers much less analysis than it does emotion. So I don't use it, but I understand why people do. Your question about the Mizrahi was whether they team up with the Palestinians, or
not necessarily like team up, but just because you talk about specifically like this very emotional reaction to the attacks, like you described, is like even more intense than 9/11 was, far more intense than 9/11 was, and how that has impacted, I guess, those sympathies which have historically been there, and if representation of Mizrahi Jews in Israel could impact governmental proceedings in any way.
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I'm competent to answer it. To make a gross generalization, the Mizrahi have been the power behind originally Begin's Likud. They've been on the right side of the political spectrum, and they tend to be, gross generalization again, rather hard line when it comes to Arabs, because many of them, the older generation anyway, came from Arab countries where they were often mistreated. Sometimes mistreated, I shouldn't say often. I think I wouldn't expect a lot of sympathy from them, in my opinion. Does that begin to confirm your question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. It's a good question. I wish I knew more, could answer it more fully. I appreciate it.
Mark, I'm going to feed in a question from Zoom. One of the Zoom participants asks whether you have any sense that Hamas, if its leadership and structure survive the Israeli attack, would be willing to consider any peace plan that does not include an end to the Jewish state.
No, they wouldn't. I think they mean what they say. They want a theocratic state, Islamic state from the river to the sea. And I think they're very serious about it. And it's one of the reasons why they've been useful to Netanyahu, because he can point to them and say, how do you expect us to negotiate with them? No solution is possible. And it's one of the reasons why he has at times financed them and given them money. There's a kind of partnership between Netanyahu and Hamas that goes back a long time, because it reduces, and this is a complicated history, but it reduces the pressure to arrive at a solution. In 2019, I think he was quoted in a ministerial meeting as saying, this is why we need to continue to support Hamas. So this is quite recent. But no, I don't think, I think Hamas is not negotiable. They have a position that, sometimes, their backers on the left will say, well, when they say a theocratic state, they're not talking about killing all the Israelis. They're talking about a secular, but it's not secular, it's theocratic. You can argue about whether they want to kill all the Israelis or not, but it's certainly a lot of those on the left who find themselves supporting them would not do very well under that regime.
Thank you for this talk. You made a very compelling case.
You're welcome.
And a very pessimistic case.
I'm sorry about that.
I understand. I wonder whether there is anywhere a glimmer of hope for the future in this whole region. I understand and I agree that this so-called two-state solution has absolutely no support of any significance now. To rely on it at present, is pointless. But I'm wondering about what used to be called, or maybe still is, the one-state solution, the kind of thing that Tony Judd was talking about a decade or more ago, in which there would be a kind of multinational state in which the civil rights of all people would be respected. I don't pretend that that is going to be any easier than the two-state solution, but it does seem to me a possible path which, if it could be pursued by some international organization or international pressure, that might yield something so that we do not lapse simply into a black hole of total pessimism.
Well, I certainly support avoiding the black hole of total pessimism, and believe me, it gave me endless problems as I was putting together this talk, because I wanted to come up with something encouraging. I was going to talk about the ice cream places in Ramallah or something, something that would be bright. I did point to what you're suggesting at the end of the talk, that it stands to logic, to reason, that if the two-state solution is being obliterated by settlements and other constructions, and if the Palestinians can't indefinitely be disenfranchised, that the obvious conclusion is that eventually they will get their full human and civil rights under some kind of arrangement. That could be a federation, that could be simply same rights for all. There are various things that have been brooded about, but I think we should, admit the enormous obstacles to that. I mean, first of all, it will be taken by many Israelis, and I include in this some friends of mine who are very, very liberal, who are completely for the two-state solution, but who think that is impossible because it would no longer be a Jewish state. It would have to be in some way a secular state. And this idea of, and of course, others who will campaign against it by saying they're going to destroy Israel, they're going to wipe out Israel, and that kind of rhetoric isn't very helpful. So I think the obstacles to it are very, very considerable. But when you look at the map, it's very hard for me to see. I mean, they had enough trouble getting the settlers out of Gaza. They had to bring the army in, and I think the army would split apart if they had to move. They'll have to move 100,000, 200,000 settlers, something like that. I mean, the majority will stay probably under a two-state solution, but half of them or so will go, a little less than half. So I'm led to where you are, which is that this is the future. But when we say future, are we talking about 30 years? I mean, a lot can happen in 30 years. So I'm very sorry for my pessimism. I apologize for it. I wish I could say, I would like to say that this attack on October 7th will shock the Israeli polity into a realization of what I've so wisely argued, that this is not going to work, what we're doing now. But I don't think that's going to be the result. The result is going to be wanting more blood, and there's going to be more blood. Blood will out, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I sympathize with your desire for optimism, but I wish I could supply it.
I was wondering if you could touch on the parallels between Palestine and Kashmir. If you have any.
Palestine
and Kashmir. Because I think that's a comparison that's been made. And then unrelated to that, I had another question about how we can get our representatives to actually reflect the opinions of who represented them. Because if you look at polling, majority of Americans want a ceasefire, and representatives are not falling in line with that opinion. And even, beyond political party lines, like that, the consensus we see, and like I think the most divisive factor is age. Like older people aren't calling for a ceasefire, but like younger generations are. Yeah. And so I think that's pretty amazing to see some consensus among the two political parties. And yeah, I've been emailing and calling my reps every day, but it's just like that. It just feels like I'm not being heard at all. And I mean, I've heard the acronym like PEP, which is like Progressive Except Palestine, where, you know, representatives, like my representative is, you know, seemingly progressive on a lot of other issues, and same with our senators in California. But then when it comes to this, they're not willing to demand a ceasefire. Like we saw it's only people of color who, you know, sponsored the ceasefire now resolution.
Mhm.
And, you know, we censored the only Palestinian American voice in Congress when, you know, other people in Congress have, you know, said to like flatten Gaza and used other inflammatory language. So I was just wondering if, yeah, those are two very different questions, but if you have any other answers in terms
I'm not really competent to compare Kashmir. When I was at the New Yorker, that was the one story I deeply wanted to do in the 90s, and I never went. So I have not been to Kashmir, and I'm hesitant to express an opinion on something that complicated, especially when comparing it to something else even more complicated. So, but your other question, I will try to engage. You know, the politics are changing around this issue. It's fascinating that I saw a poll, I think last week, out of Michigan of Arab American or Muslim American voters that said before October 7th, 57% planned to vote for Biden. Afterwards, 17%. Well, that could lose Biden, Michigan, you know, and so I think it's not a coincidence that some of this rhetoric moderated after that. I'm not saying it's the direct cause, but I think they started to realize that this is not a political winner the way it used to be. The population has changed. The other change, of course, is it's not just ethnically, but it's age-wise. It's very true that young people are very interested in this issue and feel very strongly about it. And you know, if you want to know why you're not having as much of a impact as you think you should, there was a great piece in the New Yorker a few years ago on AIPAC. Israelis have an extremely effective lobby. And, you know, and Jewish voters are influential. Some of them are fun things. And there's a lot of reasons. I mean, finally, evangelicals also, which was a coalition that began under Ronald Reagan, supporting the Jewish state, and finally, an enormous defense engagement with the Pentagon. I mean, Israel is quite crucial to the U.S. posture in the Middle East, especially at a time when the United States wants to get out of the Middle East increasingly. So Israel, it's one of the reasons why they're pushing for this Israeli-Saudi deal. So those are all factors pushing on the other side. And however, I think that poll was very interesting because I think that heralds a realization. I mean, politicians are slow about some things, but they're very quick to recognize polls. And I think you're going to have interesting changes on this issue. I don't mean everybody's suddenly going to be supporting a Palestinian state, but I think possibly now there's started to be something of an evolution that there'll really be politics surrounding this issue. I may be wrong, I don't know. But I would read about AIPAC. You know, I hate to give you the example of the NRA, but that's an example of a lobby where 80% are against them, but they still perfectly well continue to get their way. So American politics is complicated.
Mark, I'd like to give you an optimistic view of your very fine pessimistic talk.
Okay.
And it really goes back to Daniel's introduction. He set forth some protocols that describe how we'll discuss this issue civilly, coherently, politely. Whereas before I came today, MIT, where I was an undergraduate and graduate, has been inundated by campus protests, physical violence, etc. It seemed, and President Cornbrook's credit, she said nothing, and said, other than, I will get the facts. And that's what universities are supposed to do, open inquiry to try to elucidate the problem. Universities are not courts of law, legislatures, etc. I think the way you conducted this talk today and the way Daniel introduced it is a great step forward. Certainly for me, I know more about the Palestinian Jew than I did before I came here. So this is not a question, this is a thank you for bringing a deliberate and fine discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And I thank again IAS for inviting me because they organized this and I was happy to do it, but it was their idea. So thank you for those generous words, which mean a lot. I think there should be a lot of discussion around this issue in the university because it bothers a lot of people and it's important.
Yes.
So
now let's get back to the passages.
Yeah.
Do you have a question behind?
Yeah. So you use the word like expulsion, but I noticed you never use the word genocide, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
You know, I spent a lot of years covering genocides in various places, notably in Bosnia. And to me, genocide, I mean, I understand genocide, it's not a good word in a lot of ways because it was a created word. It was created by Raphael Lemkin, who was a great man after World War II, but it was a made-up word. And he had this problem, which is how do you call something, how do you name a thing so you're not destined to only use it after everybody's dead? In other words, how can you describe something that's happening, you're in the midst of, so you can stop it? So the way it's defined is, the intent to destroy a cultural group, ethnic group, etc. And under that definition, I understand why some people refer to what's going on the West Bank and Gaza as a genocide. I get it. I mean, it's not meaningless. It has meaning. But it's like apartheid. I think it doesn't help the discussion because it's like calling it, most people when they hear genocide, they think of mass murder. That's what it means to them. So it seems to be a massive overstatement, I mean, again, you can look at what's going on now and say 8,000 dead, but to most people it means mass murder with an attempt to kill everybody. So I think it's not helpful as a term. I do understand why people use it, and I don't think I would never sit here and say it's ridiculous. Don't use the term genocide. That's wrong. Because under the definition in the Genocide Convention, you can apply it, I would say. But like apartheid, I don't think it's a helpful term for the discussion. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have two semi-related questions. One, with your vast experience studying Israel, I was wondering if you had any insight into what the what the security failures and intelligence failures were that led to the October 7th attacks. And my second question was, you've mentioned previously that Israel has a right to self-defense, but you've also been very quick to criticize a lot of Israeli military operations within the Gaza region. I was wondering what your ideal policy solution would look like then, or policy response would look like to that.
Gee, that's easy. Well, those are two really good but very difficult questions. The first one, I have no special insight into what led to the failures on October 7th, apart from the obvious, what everybody knows. First of all, they didn't have any troops. They had a handful of troops around Gaza. They had decided that Gaza did not pose a threat. They had decided that their high-tech sensors and automatic machine guns and radar and all these other things they had there was fully able to handle Gaza. So at the end of the day, it's like the Americans on 9/11. It was a failure of the imagination. It was a failure to imagine that these people, I mean, it was condescending as well, that these people could do something like that. They just didn't, I think they just didn't credit them with the ability to do such a thing, which is remarkable given that they had been training in preparation for it for 2 years. And there is film of them using paragliders and all the rest that the Israelis must have had. And the Israelis also, I mean, supposedly Gaza is honeycombed with informers. So the operation was kept very, very tightly held. You know, only a handful of people knew that it was going to happen. But still, you know, I'd add that they need a lot of soldiers, as I said earlier, on the West Bank. You know, it's hard to impose an occupation when people are resisting it. So I think that's a big problem too, not enough troops. So that's the easy part. And by the way, we'll get a TikTok of this. You know, it's what journalists call a, you know, step-by-step explanation of what exactly happened. That'll come out eventually because there are too many people within the Israeli defense establishment who are pissed off about it. So I'm sure you'll eventually get a real accounting, and it'll be very interesting. So what would I do? I hate questions like that. Well, I would use force much more discreetly. I would not be bombing residential buildings. I would not be bombing hospitals. I would, you know, and we have to be clear on what that means. It means that you have to send in troops to do the dirty work. You know, for every drone or smart bomb, there's some troops who don't have to go in and risk their lives. So if you did it the way I'm saying, probably more Israelis would die. And I think we have to be frank about that. But yeah, I would not reoccupy the Gaza Strip. I would try to destroy their leadership in a relatively slow operation that would cover the whole, you know, would have to take 6 months, cover the whole of the Gaza Strip. I mean, I think you could tell from my talk that I think the major problem here is a political one, which is why I said there's some problems you can't kill your way out of. So, you know, we couldn't kill our way out of Afghanistan, you know, or Iraq. And I don't think the Israelis are going to be able to kill their way out of the Palestinian problem. I mean, they certainly tried. So I think I would get in train a political dialogue. You know, to go back to the optimism question that Harold raised and others, you know, there are some in Israel, including the liberal writer I know very well, who's brilliant, who works with Palestinians on the West Bank. And when somebody says the occupation or the settlements are too built up and too built in, the two-state solution isn't possible, he's quick to respond, we built them, why can't we unbuild them? You know, what do you mean it's not possible? Why can't you remove them? And that's an optimistic analysis. You would have to have the political wherewithal within Israel to do that. And the problem is that we have all these smart things we want the Israelis to do, but the Israelis don't want to do it as a collective. So if they ask me, I'll tell them. But I'm not optimistic that they'll be asking me anytime soon. But those are two really good questions. Thanks.
Yeah, I wonder, I think that was a really interesting response, but I wonder if I could maybe push back a little and ask sort of what kind of signal, right, in the wake of October 7th, right, you described in your presentation, bodies mutilated beyond recognition. I mean, just kind of like a barbarism hitherto unseen in this conflict. What kind of signal that sends Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the mullahs in Iran, if the initial response is just, hey, we're going to try a dialogue-based solution instead of some kind of hard retaliation.
Well, I didn't say entirely a dialogue.
Right.
I mean, I would be in there, no question about it. And there'd be enough people getting killed, but I would operate intelligently. I mean, it's like asking during Vietnam, if we withdrew, what would that signal would that send the Soviet Union? That we're not stupid? Do you know what I mean? I mean, there is a point at which you act in your interests, and acting in your interests can itself be a clear sign that you know what you're doing, rather than always acting. I mean, the Israelis are always concerned, and I read you that quote from Tom Friedman, they're always concerned to bolster their deterrence, to let you know that if you kill 1,000 of ours, we're going to kill 10,000 of yours. And there is a certain point where that becomes a kind of trap, I'm not saying I wouldn't be in there with troops, I would be. But I would not be telling myself the tale that I can eradicate Hamas. They're not going to be able to eradicate Hamas. I mean, Hamas has been there, 33 years. They're not going to be able to eradicate Hamas. So, but I take your point, that, I mean, I think that responding more intelligently has its own kind of deterrence, By the way, if they responded more intelligently, maybe they could make that Saudi deal. Maybe they could make that Saudi deal and have real provisions in it for the Palestinians, which, by the way, was what was holding it up. The right-wing cabinet didn't want a deal where they had to say anything about the Palestinians, except we won't annex it next year. So it has its own benefits, seems to me.
I was just going to say, on that note, I don't think, carpet bombing a place, that's just going to make people more radicalized. Like, I think what they're doing is just going to increase Hamas, because all these people don't have moms now, they don't have dads now. It's not going to make them be like, yeah, I'm okay with whatever Israel does. Like, they're going to want to resort to violence if you're facing them with violence. And so I think you just have to think about just war theory and like proportionality and collective punishment and all these sorts of things. And then I was just going to ask, you said enough people killed. Like, what do you mean by that? Do you see a threshold for that? 'Cause that to me just doesn't seem.
I'm sorry, did I say enough
you said,
people killed?
Yeah, in response to him, you were saying like enough, like I get in there, like enough people would be dead.
Oh.
What do you see a threshold for that? And
well,
so
I guess
how can that be justified
look,
morally?
I guess I'd like to be very clear here. Hamas attacked Israel and horribly killed more than 1,000 of their citizens, and a state has to respond to that. I mean, if Mexico invaded Texas and killed 1,000 Americans, the U.S. Army would respond. It is the proper thing to do. It is legal under international law. It's what Israel should be doing. I mean, you have to defend your citizens. I don't know the context in which I said, I think I was saying that don't worry about it. There would be dead people, and there would be in that case. I'm saying that you need to be more discriminating and not bring down whole residential buildings. I mean, I don't know how many they're going to find out died there when this is all over, but it's going to be a very, very high number. And you do not have to do that. And I think some of that is the harshness of the response is what Friedman said. It's like saying, you know what? I mean, it's like, the Americans after 9/11, we need tanks rolling down the capital of an Arab capital. That's why we need to invade Iraq. We need to show. I think there's quite a bit of that going on.
But can I respond?
Very quickly.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but much of what Israel has done is war crimes under international law, right? Like, you can't apply collective punishment to all civilians, right? Hamas was elected in 2006, 2007. Like, it's not a consensus of citizens. And I mean, again, you can't carpet bomb, like I think your argument may be, like, can't carpet bomb your way out of this. Yeah, and so, yeah, just on that note that, yes, like a state obviously has the right to self-defense, but it doesn't have the right to commit war crimes. And
yeah, well, I think I hope I made it clear during my talk that that's exactly what I believe. Yeah. But by the same token, the Israelis are not carpet bombing. They're using aerial bombardment quite ferociously. They are not carpet bombing. They are not simply indiscriminately bombing. They're killing a lot of people.
Well, thank you for your talk. I'd like to go back to the two-state solution, even though it's dead for decades. I agree with that. But I wonder, because Simon Montefiore reminded readers that in the 40s and 50s, there was a large swath of populations, Turkey or India and then Pakistan. And my question to you is, do you think or see, is there any conversation going on between the great powers to enforce, propose, or push the two-state solution, even though it would mean, a return of great power politics? But is there any conversation going on? Because China is not doing anything, to my knowledge. Russia is on the sides, even though it has connections to the population of Israel. The Americans, you mentioned Biden, and I mean, Europe is Europe. And from there, they do their stuff and talk. They like to talk. But do you see a big change?
I don't see any movement toward that at the moment. The U.S. has sort of jealously held its preeminence in this issue. They haven't welcomed the involvement of other parties. But I don't see any sign that there's going to be a major push. I mean, Biden has said it, but the only way you're going to get a two-state solution is if you're going to have to exert major, first of all, you're not going to get it with the current Israeli government at all. So you're going to have to exert major pressure on another Israeli government. So first of all, the ball is in the court of the Israeli public. Can you get people in power who support this? And right now, they're not. And I certainly haven't seen any evidence that the great powers are talking about it. And remember, a two-state solution, when you were talking about Pakistan, India, and Turkey, and so on, there wouldn't be a right of return. The right of return would be symbolic. There would be a couple thousand people they'd let in from abroad, but they wouldn't, all the Palestinians, I mean, I think the assumption is most of them wouldn't want to come back, but it would be a relatively symbolic right of return.
Can I add something? What I more meant is that even it sounds horrible, but what Turkey and Greece did is basically building ethnic homogeneous population, like back in Bosnia. It is a horrible concept, but it has been done, and sometimes it comes up in face of that conflict. But there seems to be no talk, nothing like that.
Well, but I'm not sure the parallel is very convincing, because it isn't. The West Bank now is not homogeneous. I mean, it's got 3 million Palestinians and 700,000 and counting Israelis. So, if we're comparing it to Cyprus or somewhere, and we're talking population transfers, I don't see any way any Israeli state could get all of those settlers out of the West Bank without the whole state blowing up. I just don't see it. I mean, they're true believers. They believe this land belongs to Israel. They're all armed. You would have major battles, I think, and I'm not sure the state would be able to withstand it. So,
But I need your pin.
you need my pin. Here we go.
I think what that last
Great job.
This is great.
what that last question has done is to sort of invite us to take a really big, capacious perspective on an intensely complex, fraught problem, really clustered problems. And I think that's exactly what the university should be doing. So it's really an appropriate note on which to conclude. And as we conclude, I just wanted to say, usually I conclude with a note of appreciation to the speaker, which of course I will, but I also wanted to extend a note of appreciation to all of you. This has been a really fraught, 6 or 7 weeks on campus. Ever since October 7th, our campus has been roiled by the reverberations of the crisis in the Middle East. And I think what you've all shown is that it really is possible to have a respectful, evidence-based discussion of the most controversial challenges that the world faces today. So you've all been a huge credit to this university, and I thank you for that. But I also should extend a very special note of appreciation to Mark Dana, who made this possible. It was Mark's superlative presentation, wise, balanced, nuanced, presentation of events that made it possible for us to have this ecumenical discussion on the most urgent and contested crisis of the day. So thank you, Mark.
I'm glad you asked the question about political destinations. Well, I don't want to interrupt.